Margaret. Thank you for coming in, for staying for the second panel. We want to build on some of the commentary and analysis we heard earlier this morning. And so I'll start off by asking each of our panelists who do work on very different subjects, both inside and outside of China, to give us a sense of how the reporting and research that they've been doing on their respective topics has changed over the last, say, 5 years. I think we can all agree that reporting and research in China and China's role in the world was very different before 2020, and that since 2020, roughly in line with both the greater tensions in geopolitics between the U.S. and China, as well as the pandemic, that things changed dramatically for both journalists and scholars. So I'd like to start with Jim Areddy on the end there from the Wall Street Journal, who I think very much experienced personally China's much harder line against journalists starting in the pandemic era, their own pandemic era, and then we can move onward to Margaret, Jeremy, and Shawn, and they can talk about the changes in their respective research techniques and difficulties since then.
Thanks, Ed, and happy to be here. I mean, this is almost softball question for me because how things have changed in the past several years. In early 2020, we started to hear about some kind of bug in Wuhan, and I had a chance to go down to Wuhan and see basically the government trying to keep something quiet. It was really unclear what it was they were trying to keep quiet, but we could look inside doors in hospitals and see where they would they would get their food deliveries and they're all wearing hazmat suits inside, and then they would close the door. So we knew there was something going on, and people were really afraid and nervous, and it was like amazing insight on the ground reporting that we could do. And again, he didn't even know what it was in January 2020. It was, what was going on. But by March 2020, I was told by the Chinese government that I was expelled. I had lived in Shanghai for 18 years. I had reported from there for the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones for the entire time, and had previously been in Hong Kong. So a good, more than 20 years worth of my life was suddenly upended, and I had to. I could have gone pretty much anywhere, but I decided to go to New York City, and there I continued to report about China. I've had to, in many ways, reinvent myself because I can't do any of that on the ground, fire picking, looking around. And we have to rely a lot more on Xinhua News Agency and our own sort of understanding of how the country might work, how it is working, what it is that maybe they're not saying in the way that they report development. And I mean, just in a big picture, I think we're also looking at a situation where China just isn't releasing as much information. They're not as chatty. You can't easily speak with even government officials in the way that you could before. In a way, I think the U.S. government and politicians here in Washington are very often driving the debate about what's happening with China. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. I mean, I think I'd echo a lot of the same comments, except that I've not been expelled. At least, haven't received that news. But early on, looking at this approximately 2 decades ago, slightly longer, right? There were a lot of efforts to travel to China to interface with those. And as was mentioned, I look at this through a largely China-Latin America lens. So I have the luxury of not only trying to understand what's happening in China and Chinese views on Latin America, Chinese policy toward Latin America, but also traveling throughout the region to understand how China's engagement is manifesting and has evolved over time. I'm still able to do that, right? And so have, a lot of access in that respect. But what is missing largely is that ability to engage as extensively as I had in the past with the network of scholars, of others, those that were shaping policy in different directions and in different forms, that really provided critical insight on China's views on Latin America, on the direction of certain policy, the effectiveness of certain strategies, perceptions on the China-Venezuela relationship, for instance, which have soured considerably in recent years, and understanding that directly from the observations of those that I had established relationships with there in China was valuable. So it's changed really dramatically in that way. I think another thing I would mention is that the relationship itself has evolved considerably over, unsurprisingly, right, over the course of 2-3 decades now, really since this period of enhanced engagement that started in the 1990s in Latin American context. And, as it matures, it becomes more complex. I mean, what used to be a focus on mostly by high-level bilateral engagement is now a focus on, extensive subnational engagement. What used to be a focus on massive infrastructure project development, right, sort of emblematic of the Belt and Road Initiative around 2015, 2016, is now largely a focus on much smaller projects, right, with shorter overall timelines, smaller budgets, that are prolific at this juncture, right, but are very hard to track, and are often, again, taking place at the local level. And then at the same time, we have seen, I would say, over the past 6, 7, 8 years, a massive increase in the amount of people-to-people engagement between China and wide-ranging different Latin American actors, right, that also has really critical implications. And so the complexity inherent in this new phase in the relationship makes it that much more difficult to track, right, even if you do have access to Latin America, and even if you do have, the ability to travel across the region and do the kind of research that you might want to do. And so, what that means, and I'm sure we'll get into this, so I won't say much more about it, but, that means that it will be critical for those of us here that are tracking these things, for those of us in China that are tracking everyone, right, to build networks that include those that are on the ground and monitoring these things in a real-time way, right, that are really fully plugged in and understand these developments and their wide-ranging implications, whether from an environmental, social, economic, right, perspective. And there are some major impediments and challenges and obstacles that we need to be overcome, and having to address them in the session.
So thanks, and I'm very excited to reiterate a lot of the comments that were made in the first panel. These two speakers, I can say for myself in 2020, so 5 years ago, I was finishing a book about statistics in China and the role of numbers and the manipulation of numbers as a key piece of governance inside of China. And that project, one of the nice things about being academic is the extent to which you get to choose your own projects and kind of where you want to go next. And so in part, because of the intangible nature of that project, I was very interested in working on something very material and tangible, but it also, because of COVID and the closing, the kind of increased difficulty of doing fieldwork in China, thinking about something that I could study using the GIS or satellite techniques that were talked about at the end of the last panel, kind of that are in material statistics or trade statistics that are verifiable from outdoor or from external sources. So I've moved towards thinking more about climate change and China's intersection with the problem of global climate change, decarbonization. And part of that is because of interest and its importance, and wouldn't change it for anything in the world, but it did have this strategic piece that it is easier to study because talk to people on the ground and they're not necessarily aware where their power is coming from. Like what is the generation mix in Shanghai at 12 o'clock in the afternoon? It's not an interview-based topic as much as others are. And so I think the strategic choice of a topic that can be analyzed in a world where it's harder to fly to China, it's harder to be in China, interviews in China are less forthcoming than they used to be. And then even the data itself, there's just less data released than there was previously. So I think from an academic's perspective, trying to be strategic in the questions that we try to ask and that we can answer well is something that I've thought about over the past 5 years. Well, thanks everyone for having me. I apologize if I'm looking at my phone. I've got a story that's on the runway that may go out at some point during this panel. So, look, I echo everything that's been said, beforehand. I'm in a slightly different position that I was never based in China. I was based in Asia. I was based in Hong Kong for the Financial Times at the time, was editing China, coverage from there. But I've been looking at kind of how China is interacting with the rest of the world in one way or another for most of the last 10, 15 years. And the big change for me, besides not being able to go to China a couple times a year, which was invaluable because China really does look different up close than it does in the kind of sometimes the cartoon pictures that are of it, or the stereotypes. But it's also just being able to engage and have frank conversations with Chinese economists, with Chinese officials outside of China. Everyone's just gotten a lot more shy, right? And everyone's just gotten much more cautious in sharing frank views and in being quoted, right? And we as journalists like to be, we're just vehicles for other people's opinions and analysis in a lot of ways. And it's harder to get that kind of frank analysis. I keep wondering if we're, I think of the China that I interacted with when I was based in Indonesia in the early 2000s, and that was the kind of China going shyly out into the world. It was the time when there was a colleague James King wrote a very good book in 2006 about China Shakes the World, and at the time it opens with this amazing scene of manhole covers disappearing around the world. And it was a story of China's appetites to shake the global economy as a result. And in Indonesia, I saw covered the Indian Ocean tsunami in late 2004 and 2005, and I remember watching this kind of aid mission with Chinese. I think they were PLA or they were kind of emergency response, setting up camp at the airport in Banda Aceh, right next to this field hospital that had been set up by USAID. And there was one country that was very good and had a lot of practice at kind of responding to emergencies in the US, and you could see them kind of racing to get involved. And then you could see China, this Chinese group of a few dozen people kind of setting up this very neat camp at the airport and then just waiting to see where they were needed, right? And then on day one, it was like they didn't leave the perimeter around their tents. And then on day two, they kind of moved a little bit closer. By day three, they were working with the US in the field hospital in some ways and kind of helping just because everyone was needed on the ground. And now I feel like we have this completely different China. It's just much more confident in going out into the world, and yet is very cautious. You might even say sometimes thin-skinned in its engagement with the rest of the world, and protects its image incredibly carefully, and that really hits us on a day-to-day basis when we're trying to engage, just have frank conversations, just to understand what's going on.
I wanted to just go more deep into some of the research topics that each of you work on. And when I start off with Jeremy, I had a thought in my head when you were talking about how scholars have the freedom to a certain extent choosing their research topics, and how you veered from studying statistics to studying change in environmental policy, because it reminded me of something that a professor told me at grad school, where he was saying Benedict Anderson did Imagine Communities, sort of seminal book, because he was banned from doing research in Indonesia. So he could no longer do Indonesia-specific research, and decided to write this book up with vast transnational theories instead. So like that can really change the scholarship. But you are still able to go to China. You went to China this past summer. And so I want to ask you two questions related to your research. One is, what did it feel like to be on the ground so recently in China? And how is that shaping the research you're doing, having that access? And two, in terms of how we think about China's environmental policy, I was just thinking that it's often discussed in this duality where China is either, the savior of humanity because it is innovating green technology and pushing it out in the world, or it will lead to the planet's destruction because it's still the greatest greenhouse gas emitter, and is still invested in coal. So I was just wondering, there's this duality in the discourse. I was just wondering how, as a researcher, you made sense of that through your on the field, on the ground research.
That's great. So I was in based in Shanghai this summer for about a month. I did take a side trip to Ordos in Inner Mongolia, which for me was this great location that is a microcosm of China's kind of political economy. It is if you know about Ordos, it's probably because of the Go City reporting about it now 18 years ago, where there was empty buildings and row after row of apartment buildings and empty plazas. But it also it's a coal town. The Go City was built on coal mining profits. And so, but it now it's the Western China where there's lots of space, there's lots of wind, and there's lots of sun, and you have huge renewable energy mega basins. So being able to go and actually see that the Go City is not full but not empty is like kind of something that you can read in statistics, but you can actually feel it in person that the buildings are not unoccupied in the way that they were. But to know that there's 30,000 people that are under the ground at any one time in Ordos kind of mining coal, but there's also gigawatts of solar happening at the same time. There's just nothing that can really, even if you know those statistics, you can read the corporate reports that suggest this is happening, actually go and see the realities of them and to talk to the people who are doing that work is really invaluable. On the broader narrative, it is this kind of from villain to hero or potential hero narrative that I think is really fascinating and has a lot of truth in it. So for instance, last week, Xi Jinping announced China's updated commitment to the Paris Agreement, its NDC. And a lot of the coverage of that of the new commitments, the update was quite positive. It was tepid but positive. And in part that's because of the United States. The United States, because Trump has again pulled out of the Paris Agreement, and kind of is talking about beautiful clean coal. China's relatively unambitious targets, emissions reduction targets by 2035 of 7 to 10% reductions it was seen as the adults in the room. This is serious, someone taking decarbonization seriously in a world that isn't. But I think something that I think is really important for China scholars and journalists to think about is not just to think about China as a funhouse mirror of the United States or as competitor to the United States, but take China on its own terms. I think one of the hardest things that I found, not in research terms, but in writing terms, what editors want is to write about China as China. And that kind of with its nuance and complexity and to dive into different places and different stories that don't all fit together in a neat way or that is dangerous or something else. And so I think that's when I think about where kind of like my frustrations with the NDC and the weakness of the fact that it's been accepted as this positive development, when I think it really reflects a real political economy weakness of the state, is to me one of the things that I think is my sense of trying to right size and kind of right shape China.